I'm not a historian, so I'll have a lot of opinion and very little fact to put that opinion on. I come to this through public order, actually public order policing. So the Oka crisis was a public order policing crisis before it was a military standoff, military worry standoff. And I also take it from a sort of critical institutional perspective. I've done a little bit of work on securitization, so I thought to sort of put myself into this, I would draw upon this notion of militarization and see how the Oka crisis reflected or provided an example of where the limits of militarization may be, because there has been quite a bit of work recently on sort of the advance of militarization, and it seems to me that Oka may be an indication of where one sees pretty strong limits to how militarization can go forward. And so, and I've seen sort of look at militarization as in terms of eruptive events. We understand quite well now that some eruptive events will be very dramatic in providing a rationale or a discourse for militarization, and 9/11 is, of course, the most dramatic illustration of that. So in this paper, I consider the Mohawk-Oka Crisis as a sovereignty standoff that demonstrates the limits of support for the extraordinary retreat of the civil authority. So it has been, the crisis has been reviewed. It's been gone over by many books, a film, documentary. So it's a ground that has been well trodden. And so one of the arguments has been that we can see it in terms of the proven efficacy of securitization through military deployment. And in some respects that is true, but I'm going to point out that that really depends on where you stand. And so it is true so far as media is hot and opinions may be cold and calculated. So I conclude that the resolution of the crisis as distinct from the dispute supports the view that confronted with this category of crisis and its strong cultural legacy and limiter, public order militarization is here a counterproductive overstep, neither necessary nor useful to a durable government or military position or optics. It's a very strong statement, and I suppose, given a little more time, I could probably make the opposite argument. But for 14 minutes, that's all I can do. So in bubbling over to become a matter of demanding the attention of first municipal, then provincial, the Sûreté de Québec, and then federal political and security authorities, sovereignty standoff will challenge the resolve and the patience of all parties. And if you're American, you'll know that in Waco, Texas, there was a standoff that challenged the resolve of all sorts of authorities and ended in a very, very disturbing fireball where children and women and children, as well as the remaining men in the compound, were killed, or well, in any case, died. So state authorities are sometimes slow to recognize that a sovereignty standoff requires measures of conciliation, not unlike diplomacy and international relations. And I will draw on Beer here to say that sovereign relations with Aboriginals may be considered to be an area where international relations can provide and should be providing a little more guidance. So the decision to brandish violence is in the first instance a choice to engage dynamic resources in advance of or against a sovereign claim. The vast majority of political conflict is resolved without the resort by either side to instruments of violence, and governments are not uniform in their approach or view, and some government leaders may believe that the challenge to their authority that native land claim occupation signify rises to the level of requiring a very firm response, as is illustrated by a couple of quotes from, what do I do here? The quotes are there. Some of the leaders at the time. So one way in which an event may fall short is in the attendant narrative characterizing the antagonist or foe. This is where a standoff of this character in the 1990s is and was a different beast than it might be at other stages of historical development. So the additional burden means that the prudent management of the civil-military relation, and this is really an entry point that I take, the discussion about the relationship between civil and military, means that the government in this context needs to accommodate a limited return of sovereignty and thus avoid a violent confrontation that has weak solidarity at the back of it. So there are a few considerations. First, it is understood that once it comes to be a military operation, it has the potential to do a great deal of damage to the way that the military is viewed and reviewed by people. And so that is a consideration. So events are more or less read up as worthy of more or less diplomacy or conciliation. They must be managed in their representations. Once an event is handed over to the military, that dynamic construction may be problematic. Some political authorities may have more difficulty in managing that relation. However, as we'll see, there was a great deal of effort placed on managing the optics of that event. Second, the Native or Aboriginals or First Nations or whatever land claim dispute is recognized by knowledgeable civil authorities as a particularly sensitive problem or conflict. There were standoffs at Ipperwash in Ontario, at Burnt Church in Nova Scotia. The Burnt Church, Nova Scotia standoff was resolved quite well by very sophisticated RCMP liaison negotiations. Not so much the case in Ipperwash, another famous standoff that ended badly. Dudley George was killed in that standoff. So it depends on different levels of experience and knowledge which are evident on the ground. Where militarism is bolstered and fostered by government actors and interested parties, the besieged authority is implicated by the sovereign state in matters of cultural preference, dogma, and, to quote Fanon, sometimes terror. In this regard, a national security panic may be compared to a moral panic that involves much the same features, namely that a flashpoint is already prepared by an anticipatory social and political narrative. Well, this is the idea of militarization by eruptive event. Now, Oka, I'm using as an example where the idea of the flashpoint that is followed by a political narrative, this is an exception to that rule. In some, there's a flashpoint and a ready narrative. Military action, of course, is the necessary preserve of state and interstate actors, and these are disciplined by liberal democratic conventions. There's at least two versions of the birth of the nation state. One is what might be called a dirty birth version, where the state emerges in conflict and manages to win over antagonists. those antagonists are then more or less othered. They become ulterior peoples. Sometimes they become characterized as savage or barbarous in order to support the claim of the victorious nation, so to speak. Of course, there is the other view, which is that the liberal democratic development is based basically on the rule of law, and that the relationship with those individuals, those so-called ulterior individuals, is one that is modified by that rule of law. And when you review an example like Oka, you can see shades of both of those narratives. It's true that both of them are evident. So disputes draw from a theme that reaches into the core of the sovereignty question, and that poses an enormous challenge for authorities, as authorities. If a conflict consists of antagonists, in these disputes, the antagonists play high stakes, as the local issue is directly connected to a recognition of authority. So issue antagonists become sovereignty antagonists. So Beer coins the term hegemonologue to refer to how a dominating society quashes a discussion of indigenous affairs and international relations and draws upon a common dominant view of order. So following Steve Smith, he suggests that the omission of or silence regarding indigenous affairs suggests the discipline's loudest voice. And as Balzac puts it, security discussions only happen when there are questions about the current state of a polity, that is, when there is a form of uncertainty. He continues, in trying to intuit why security is dealt with or not addressed in the way it is, we need explicitly to engage in the management of ambiguity, since the difficulty of speaking security owes something to the ambiguity that always looms in the background of security talks. So Oka is a case of very anxious non-recognition, by some at least, of the ambiguous sovereign relation. So Oberg draws on Jean Baudrillard. He warns that transparency works as an ideology of social control. So in looking at Oka, I saw that one of the responses in reviewing the significance of Oka is that it really indicated the efficacy of the military in dealing with such conflicts. And so military efficacy is something that has been looked at by Oberg. And he draws on Jean Baudrillard to argue that there is a architecture of transparency. So what he says is that operational, in the ideology of transparency, a grid of operational violence fixes subjectivity in modeling algorithms and the processing that occurs in networks and closed loops. It is manifested in self-referential repetitions and modulations that can be seen in proposed military operational codes. Consequently, as a technique of control, a military imaginary is concerned with the political impact of the technical aspects of warfare. So conceptualizing how transparency and governing are linked to military operations, Oberg draws on Baudrillard, who warned that transparency works as an ideology of social control. In liberalism, the modernist desire for a democratic rationality is presented in architectures of transparency. This adduces choice as an illusory value. So in Baudrillard's ideology of transparency, that is what takes place. So in Operation Salon, there was a dynamic military deployment using regular Army planning and deployment procedures involving up to 3,300 officers and soldiers, 20 helicopters, 2 fighter planes, Aurora reconnaissance aircraft, a signals intelligence units, 3 high-tech Leopard tanks, and numerous artillery. In addition, the CF used psychological operations such as low-level flights, spotlights, military encroachment, live broadcasts of operations, aggressive nighttime reconnaissance patrols undertaken to gather intelligence on warrior dispositions, to make noise or intimidate them, and on one occasion to steal a warrior flag. As Lachenbauer summarizes, these were relentless psychological operations that advanced on Mohawk positions, pushing them back and unhinging them psychologically. LeMay in 1990 remarked on the strategy of transparency. This openness was part of their strategy. The effect of the media could not only have added to the dissuasive force created by the deployment of the 5th Brigade. The modern media participates in events such as much as it describes them. The initial view of Oka by some analysts was that at least the press was more or less in agreement with the military operation. Subsequently, and certainly in other media formats, that initial observation hasn't really withstood the test of time. Alternative narratives of Oka have now proliferated, and I could make a reference, and actually, I can, if you want, I can have the paper ready to send whoever's interested, such that those alternative narratives are now quite prolific when you review Oka in various contexts. So the effort to use a culture of transparency is a little bit more complicated than one might think, not having reference to the military discourse of people like Oberg. Thank you.